All right, welcome back. Thank you all very much. I know these have been long days, and I really appreciate everybody's continued engagement. I wanted to follow up on a couple things you asked me about. One was there was a question about whether private schools, private secondary schools were funded through TRIO. I checked, they are eligible to participate in TRIO programs the same way they are in Gear Up. They may not be as competitive in that program. The program's structured differently. So I don't think we've had too many of them, and I don't know, I don't have a number how many are currently in the program, but they are eligible the same way they're eligible in Gear Up. Gear Up staff is looking into the other Gear Up question you asked about how we interpret the independent provision, contracting individual teachers versus contracting the school. And I'm hoping that we can get an answer to that while we're here. Ashley will keep an eye on the email. If not, I can send you an answer between the sessions. You had also asked about the definition of pervasively sectarian. That has not been defined, so there's no definition in statute. And I also spoke with Anne Marie and also with the people heading up the committee that's looking at distance ed, and indicated that I thought it made sense, and you had expressed an interest in looking at 600.9 and 11. They both agreed that your expertise is very needed in that, and I don't see any problem, so we should definitely look at those sections when we come back next time. So, all right, any procedural questions? All right, we're ready to dig back in. So we have one more Gear Up provision left, and that is Gear Up grants, Gear Up partnership grants have fiscal agents that have to be either LEAs or institutions of higher education. The current language says institutions of higher education that is not pervasively sectarian. And I'm sorry, I said that wrong. Institution singular. An institution of higher education that is not pervasively sectarian. We believe that the clause that is not pervasively sectarian violates the free exercise clause because it's relating to the status of the institution and not the use of the funds. So we're proposing to delete that clause. Richard.
Can you provide the specific legal authority on which you're basing that conclusion, please? What case law and what interpretations you're looking at?
I have been conferring with our general counsel's office, and that's their bottom line, but I don't have the case law. I mean, I'm not with the general counsel's office.
The puzzle here is, so the department's position is that this is a free exercise problem. The distinction in the term come from Supreme Court precedent that remains valid precedent, and it gets to not the identity of the institution, which again is the as the department has described, so much of what it's doing here has purported to describe it as being about Trinity Lutheran. The idea of a pervasively sectarian institution gets to a particular puzzle, which is this. If the government can be in the position of funding secular services at or through religious entities, the provision of secular services, that's not a problem. But the idea from the Supreme Court precedent of a pervasively sectarian institution is that everything is so infused with religion in every aspect that without violating the institutional mission, the institution can't treat something as secular, can't perform something in a secular way. It's about how effectively how the institutions define their own religious mission, and that gets to the problem that I think the regulation was trying to deal with, where the government is limited to providing secular services And if they would be, if it would try to do that in an environment where you can't have secular services because the institution doesn't believe that there's any way to do that, that's the problem. And that's not a free exercise problem because it respects the fact that the religious institution gets to have every aspect of its work thoroughly pervaded, that's the term, right, with religion, and gets to do it in that way. It just means that in that narrow class of circumstances, that's a situation where the government can't, in that environment, provide the services. It has to do it someplace else, so as not to interfere with the religious mission of the entity. That's what it's getting at, and that doesn't strike me as a problem. It strikes me as a good thing for respecting the institutions, and also what remains constitutionally required.
So the department's legal authority would be a Supreme Court case 19 years ago, Mitchell versus Helms, and I'm sure that is what they were looking at, where the plurality opinion it completely disclaimed the use of pervasively sectarian for reasons I'll go into in a second, and then the concurring opinion of O'Connor and Breyer did not use that test either. So it's been basically understood that Mitchell v. Helms has buried the pervasively sectarian use of the term that was used a lot in the 70s and 80s. But the problems with it are that it violates both the free exercise and the establishment clauses. It's actually so pervasively sectarian, for it to work, it means that government officials have to be deciding how religious an institution is. And it's okay to be sort of religious, but not too religious. And that's exactly the kind of decision that the government's not to be making, or distinction that it's not to be making. And so the best articulation beyond Mitchell v. Helms of why this is an establishment clause problem is a decision by at the time, Judge Michael McConnell, who's probably the leading scholar in the church-state area, when he was on the 10th Circuit, and the case is Colorado Christian University versus Weaver, and he spent several pages explaining why pervasively sectarian is no longer the Supreme Court's test, because, of course, he was bound to follow Supreme Court precedent. But he goes into it in quite a bit of detail, and the two takeaways are that the Establishment Clause is violated by making this distinction, and that actually becomes discrimination among religions, which is an absolute command of the Establishment Clause that's not to be done by the government, and that triggers strict scrutiny, and then also the other problem is that the government then has to troll through who believes what and how much they believe it. And so those are actually two separate violations of the Establishment Clause. And then it becomes a free exercise problem too, because of course, as we saw in the 80s and 90s, I think a lot of the people who are at Christian schools, you saw religious schools being counseled by their attorneys to look less religious. Couch your mission in secular terms and don't look so religious if you want to participate in government programs. And so that in itself is a chilling effect on free exercise of religion, because these institutions should be allowed to be openly religious and be very honest about what their religious beliefs and mission are. So that's where that's why this is a very good deletion, in order to bring this regulation into compliance with current Supreme Court law.
So a couple of things that, Kim, I know you won't be surprised that I'll say, and you won't be surprised about as the law either, is, look, the 10th Circuit, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit, or a panel of the 10th Circuit, cannot overrule decisions of the U.S. Supreme Court. Judge McConnell's opinion, whatever it may be, doesn't change Supreme Court authority. It can't. the plurality in Mitchell is not the controlling decision. The concurrence is, it's under the Marx rule, the narrowest decision that on which the decision can be, the decision was premised, is the one that's controlling. That is the concurrence. So none of that attempt to say that the doctrine is no longer good law can be squared with clear Supreme Court precedent, not only the precedent on the doctrine itself, but the precedent on how to read and interpret and apply Supreme Court doctrine. So that really has to be set aside. Now, to get to the substance of it, I'm going to go back to what I said before, which is when the question is when the governmental requirement is as driven by and required by the Establishment Clause that the government can't be in the business of providing religious instruction, religious services, then the question is, can it provide these services in a way that is secular and complying with the law? And what this regulation gets to is the narrow set of instances in which, because the institution defines itself in a particular way and organizes itself in a particular way, that just can't happen. That's what it's getting to. That remains the controlling law, and I really worry again about striking legal requirements that have been in place for a long time and that remain the law, and what message that sends about the department being uninterested and unwilling to enforce the law, which I don't think it is and certainly shouldn't be the department's intent.
So I sort of feel like I'm literally between two legal opinions here. But the issue for me immediately, and then I have a more distal kind of concern, is did I hear you say that it's the interpretation of the counsel for the Department of Education that this is potentially inconsistent with the current Attorney General guidance? So is it the Ed Department counsel's opinion that this is a concerning phrase?
I don't know that I can say that
Okay.
specifically. Our counsel's office did have concerns about this. I don't know that I can
They had
tie it to
concerns
the
about it being
attorney.
in or about it being deleted?
They would prefer to have it deleted. They have concerns about it being in.
Okay, so that's not quite a clear read. When I've been in professional or state bodies before, we've often had someone from an attorney general's office or general counsel say, here's my take of that. And we could then decide to run at risk of the legal advice we were given, but usually we would conform with it. So I have two competing opinions from a legal standpoint, and it sounds like Kim's opinion is siding more with the impression you're getting from the counsel office, but we don't know that.
So our general counsel's office does have concerns about this with respect to free exercise and establishment clause. You had asked whether it was tied to the Attorney General memo.
Oh,
and
okay, fine, their rationale, right, I don't know.
I don't know whether they-
But they do have concerns, your
They
counsel.
do have
for Ed.
concerns, yes.
Okay. So conceptually, I don't like the phrase because I don't know how you do, like, is it 41% religious? 41% of the areas where they're involved are religious is not yet pervasive, but 51% is. And how anyone would decide that, it's just, it doesn't fit the realities of religion as I understand it or have studied it as a psychologist of religion. And so there's an area of research, for instance, called sanctification research, and it's applied to lots of different fields, but that body of research suggests that people can sanctify in all kinds of mundane things, and when they sanctify it, that is in their mind, view it as a sacred opportunity or activity, even if it's engaged in what we might think of as a secular role, it alters the psychosocial consequences of behavior. So that line of research now is 20 years old, it's well established, and it's looked at lots of different areas of life, but it does have powerful predictive value in terms of empirical correlates. So I would have to know the subjective state of the people engaged in the activities to know whether or not it was religious in motivation or intent. And I don't know how the government would ever do that kind of an assessment as a psychologist of religion. That's concerning to me. And so it makes sense, the interpretation Kim's given that constraint. But on the legal matter, I would have to defer. So.
So this feels like it follows on the conversation earlier where we were discussing a scenario in which religious individuals, religious agencies, religious schools can in fact provide secular educational services. So that seems to be a line that we can in fact identify. And the reason that that relates to this conversation at the moment is that that word pervasively seems quite operative. It seems to point to a scenario in which there is a religious organization that would be running afoul of its own mission were it to provide secular educational services or benefits. So in terms of the question of like, how do we measure, can we measure, it seems that there's an implied reality that we actually do have the skills to do that. And therefore it does seem applicable to say that we are concerned about a religious institution that would be unable to provide a secular service. Yeah.
So I wanted to obviously provide a practitioner's perspective on this and to provide a little bit of additional context and background knowledge. So as long as this has been a regulation, there are no known examples of institutions seeking to apply to be part of a grant, participate in a program, and that this is there's never been a concern here. So this is a solution in search of a problem. There is no known problem. It's important to distinguish that the way the Gear Up partnership programs work is that any institution of higher education can participate. Any. There is no restriction. The restriction has to do with whether or not that entity can serve as a fiscal agent. And so, because there are no examples of it, I have to sort of hypothesize about what the consequences of that would be. So, as the fiscal agent for a discretionary grant, that entity has the ability to determine which partners are hired, which contractors are selected, and the scope of services that are provided. Because even though we may agree that we don't know what a definition of a pervasively sectarian institution of higher education is. A couple of things. One is that if a pervasively sectarian institution of higher education were to become the fiscal agent and have the powers and authorities that are associated with that, there would be an opportunity in which there would be a conflict in which these institutions have in terms of their rights to select or discriminate based on employment that may not be transferable to the requirement around services and benefits that are being provided through Gear Up. There is a concern that requirements that such institutions place on students to participate in that institution could be potentially applied to students that participate in the program, and there is a potential that those practices could be both in violation of the free exercise clause of those students that want to participate in these services and who are eligible to participate in these services, but however are being forced to make a choice between receiving these services and subscribing to a particular ideology. That is a concern. I think that there is also a concern of a chilling effect in the opposite direction, that whereby a family or students who know that they're eligible, if they know that the program is being run by a pervasively sectarian institution of higher education, as opposed to a local school district, that there could be a chilling effect in terms of, well, if I choose to enroll my son or daughter in this program? Am I being forced to participate in activities that aren't consistent with my own beliefs? Am I forced to ask my child to engage in an ideology that I don't agree with? None of that whatsoever has anything to do with what the intent of Gear Up. College and career readiness is a technical service. And I don't know why this was put in, but I do know that the concern of the change exposes the department and exposes the Gear Up community to having to respond to circumstances that, A, we don't have to respond to right now, and B, we don't have any indication that it is a concern. And so I think that there is, while I can't necessarily speak to some of the legal conversations that have been going on here, I can say that this hasn't been an issue up until now, and that there could easily be concerns that permeate as a result of this. Let me repeat: institutions of higher education that are pervasive sectarian can participate. It's just that having the role as the fiscal agent changes the engagement and the discourse.
As Haven has mentioned, pervasively is the word we have to focus on, right? And what does it mean? It means relevant, or prevalent. And I'm sure there are many.
Might need to be a little closer to the microphone on the live stream. Thank you.
A meaning would be prevalent. A prevalent, or what is it? Pervasively is more than 51%. I am sure that there are cases on this word. And I think the language should stay in because there is a meaning to the word pervasively.
Historically in the case law, going back years in the Establishment Clause, pervasively sectarian was code word for Catholic. I mean, that was the evil that was trying to be remedied, was financial aid from the government going to support a Catholic school. To me, this really seems like exactly the Trinity Lutheran situation, where you do have a federal program that's being denied to an institution based on the fact that they are pervasively sectarian. Just my opinion, but any Christian university, it should probably be their goal to be pervasively sectarian. Now, for terms of this, I would argue, of course, we're not pervasively sectarian if we wanted to apply for a Gear Up grant. But if you walk around our campus, I hope what you see is Scripture is pervasive. We are a very sectarian Christian university. When I say sectarian, I'm talking about Christianity in a broad sense. That's what we're hoping to do. And for us to not be able to participate in a federal program simply because of that does run afoul of the Establishment Clause.
So, as I understand it, there is nothing about this that speaks at all to universities being able to have Gear Up students or Gear Up students being able to go to particular universities. This is about who the government contracts with to administer the program, administer the money. And so it doesn't affect, I think, the problem that you talk about at all, because students can make that choice to go to your university or any other. The Supreme Court has defined, Tom raised that this is a legal term. There must be a definition. And in fact, the Supreme Court has said The requirement is that no state aid at all can go to institutions that are so pervasively sectarian, and here's where it comes, that secular activities cannot be separated from sectarian ones, and that if secular activities can be separated out, they may alone be funded. In other words, it's a legal definition that means very specifically the institution that might be seeking to be the Gear Up grantee to run one of these programs can say we can offer something, we can draw a line and do some things that are secular, and those things can be government funded. Even if we're also doing some other things that are religious, we can draw a line and say we are capable of providing a secular service on the government's dime to these students. As long as they can do that, then they're eligible to be this to be this agency to run the programs and give the money. And again, none of that affects the either which students are eligible or where they can go to school.
I think a point made earlier in the day stands to be useful here as well about keeping first things first, that this is about a benefit and service provided to students, not to institutions. And so to me, seeing this in that context, line B reads with a sort of parenthetical implication at the end, an institution of higher education that is so pervasively sectarian that it is unable to provide secular benefits and services. I'm not suggesting right now that that is the language we go to. Don't throw up an option up there. But to me, that is the spirit of what we're getting at here. And I think to remember that this is about student benefits, not institutional benefits, is a continuing concern.
So again, I don't know what a secular good or service is apart from a religious one. That makes no sense to me from lots of different faith traditions. So I worked at UMass Medical Center with John Kabat-Zinn, who launched the mindfulness movement that, Time Magazine has on supermarket checkouts every month. I have another friend who's a Buddhist psychologist in Beijing who's quite unhappy about that movement because he thinks it is pop Buddhism and it's just desecrating of Buddhism. Mindfulness is everywhere in public programs. And John Kabat-Zinn himself, of course, is Buddhist and has started a Buddhist meditation center in Cambridge. And from that point of view, those things are intertwined within their perspective. Yoga, we could go on, where things are, the American Hindu Association sees yoga as inherently and essentially Hindu, but how many of our public schools have yoga programs? And so we can go on with examples like this. What I'm saying is religions conceptualize things differently. I've frequently seen people in my field, so when I worked in the military as a psychologist, the work we did would rarely be identified by someone just looking at it as explicitly religious, but we certainly thought of what we were doing as a religious act. And to make these distinctions, it starts to break down when you're talking about yogic practices or mindfulness techniques, specifically if the goal is the dissolution of self, somehow informed by a Buddhist perspective. This becomes part and parcel of what I see everywhere, all around the world. And if it just means you have to use code words or hidden language, and then it's okay. I don't know why whatever pervasively, well, let me say this differently. Let's say you have a place that we all agree somehow isn't pervasively religious, but in the 1% of the religious they hand out evangelistic tracts to people. So you come, you get completely normal services, but at the end they give you a tract. Wouldn't that be problematic in the kind of uses you're talking about, more so than a place that is always thinking of what they're doing as religious, but the activity they're providing is a good in and of itself, regardless of what else is present that we want valued and we want to achieve. The establishment issue, it feels like a much bigger conversation. I personally, as a person of faith, as someone who works at a faith-based institution, don't want to see the government building competitor religion institutions of worship down the street. So these folks are my friends. We research together. We're on dissertation committees for each other's students. but we're not in the business of building each other's houses of worship. And that kind of thing seems really clear to me. But when we're talking about a public benefit, and we're allowing the government to distinguish what is secular, what isn't, it literally feels like I'm in an alternate reality from what I perceive from religious individuals. It's not how they think about these things unless they have compartmentalized lives. If that's what we mean, that's one style of religiousness, but it's not specific to any religion, and it's certainly not ubiquitous.
I was just going to ask a practical question. In this partnership, Andrew, would the institution of higher education, would the OMB commingling guidelines apply to that institution? When we talked about the OMB guidelines earlier, I mean, was that directed at these fiscal agents?
Yes, the fiscal agents for all of our grants are required to follow the OMB circulars, which address a lot of things in addition to the commingling of funds. And I actually was wanting to bring up that somebody had mentioned something about hiring decisions. There's guidelines around those kinds of things as well. So the fiscal agent, regardless of what type of entity they are, need to follow the federal government's rules, which are outlined in the OMB circulars.
My follow-up then is if those OMB guidelines apply and the money has to be segregated from other dollars anyway, what does it matter if it's a pervasively sectarian institution if it has to keep that money separate and use it only for those Gear Up activities anyway?
Two things. I want to respond, and then I want to ask a question. So, the Gear Up program, through both the statute and regulation and the notice of funding availability, speaks precisely about what types of activities are eligible. I think it's important for us not to blur what public schools may or may not be doing to engage students versus what is happening in Gear Up. There are no yoga programs, there are no mindfulness programs within Gear Up. That's not to say that those things aren't happening in public schools, and I think that that's a valid point. But if during the break I went down the hall and asked my program officer, "Can I use Gear Up money for yoga?" I know what the answer is, because it's not, and she would say to me, "How is that advancing the academic enrichment, career education, and post-secondary success of your students?" And I would say it's probably not. So that's why I would not want to do that. So I think that there are, and I agree with what Haven said earlier, that the services and benefits up above, which the guardrails of the federal funding need for them to be secular, that if it may be putting an unreasonable expectation on a pervasively sectarian institute of higher education to both adhere to its mission and the requirements that it puts on its staff, and be able to offer those services at the same time. It just might be too difficult to disentangle those two, and so that is probably the rationale for why that it's in there.
So the question about determining what's secular versus religious in instruction is something that we deal with all the time in the law and in practice, and it's really, really well settled that public schools can't engage in religious instruction. They have to have secular instruction, and we know what that is. And the fact that, I as a teacher in a public school might be teaching in a public school because I, as a matter of faith, believe that it's important to teach, doesn't render my classroom instruction that I provide religious, this distinction that we deal with all the time in saying here's what public institutions, public education, public schools can do, and here's what they can't do with respect to religion is about what that instruction actually looks like. And we're talking about the same thing here as I understand the program, and I think the answer is for what this clause means. If you can provide these services in a way that is secular, whatever your motivation for doing that, then you don't have a problem under the statute, under the reg. And if you can't do that, if you understand that it's not just that we're doing this as a matter of our religious mission, but that the way we actually are going to counsel these kids is to proselytize further the religious mission in that concrete way, the same as what if a public school is teaching X. That's where it causes a problem, and to be able to say, if you can't draw that line, then you shouldn't be a government agent for running this program. That's nothing like discrimination. I mean, to start out with, there is no right to be an agent for the government. What there is a right not to be discriminated against on impermissible grounds in being selected, and saying I can't run the program that is required of me is a valid and appropriate reason to say I can't be the fiscal agent for the government. And I think that's what it's getting at.
Well, I was just going to say that the distinction that Richard's making about the fact that the government within its own schools can decide what to teach and not teach, and what its employees can and can't say, is very different than looking at what a Christian college or another religious college is doing. And this was the point of Justice Powell, I think it was Anik versus Pittenger, even back in the heyday of pervasively sectarian, that it's a very different issue when the government is, the term we use is trolling through its own practices. That doesn't raise Establishment Clause or free exercise problems. But when the government is trolling through religious institutions' practices and behavior, then that is very much an Establishment Clause problem. And that's always been a distinction that the law has drawn, even when pervasively sectarian was an accepted concept, which it no longer is.
So the distinction that you drew, I think, speaks directly, but in a different way, to this program, because when the government is hiring and contracting with an agent to provide a government program, a government service, that's the same as when the government is doing it internally when it's the public school, deciding that instead of having Gear Up done through the program officer here making all the decisions about who gets a grant, instead to turn around and hire and contract with Andrew's organization to do that. This is the same as is done across the board in under all the faith-based regulations. Is when you want to be a government contractor providing a government service on the government's dime, you have to do it in ways that comply with the government regulations. And one of those things is that because the government itself can't be providing religious instruction, it can't be hiring somebody else to do that either. Again, that's what this is getting to, and to say that the government isn't supposed to troll around in what your university does is right, is absolutely right. But if your university says we want to be in the position where we're going to be not acting as the university but acting as an agent for the Department of Education in running a government program, that's completely different, and it's recognized across the board in statutes and in regulations and everything else, as well as in the case law, is different.
I mean, focusing in on what this section is specifically, it's not about the services, it's about managing the money. And what this says, I mean, if you flip it around, what it says is this particular type of religious institution, we don't trust to manage the money, even under the OMB regulations. So I don't see any way that leaving that language in avoids an establishment clause issue.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo that this is referring to Richard's comment, which is that the more we talk about we're disqualifying someone from being an agent of the government in this particular matter based on their status as a pervasively sectarian institution, the more we come back to Stephen's earlier point that this looks very much like the type of discrimination that violated the Free Exercise Clause in Trinity Christian Lutheran. I haven't mentioned before, but there's a series of regulations, and I think the Department of Education has them as well, but I haven't looked, which I should have before this meeting. But they're called the Equal Treatment of Faith-Based Groups. And they are regulations that came out under the Bush II administration, but then the Obama administration and the Trump administration just recently reaffirmed the bulk of those regulations. And basically, it's how can the government interact with faith-based groups in providing social services that the government wants to basically pay for through grants. And it's those regulations don't use pervasively sectarian. They don't try to make these kinds of distinctions at all. And they very much, if you want to think of them as turning faith-based groups into agents, which I think isn't the right way to think about it, but they're very accepting of the idea that pervasively sectarian religious groups can provide all of these social services, and there's very few restrictions on what they can do.
Two things. One, in response to Stephen, I don't necessarily subscribe to the notion that this is about whether or not the department trusts a pervasively sectarian institute of higher education to manage the money. It's a question of the autonomy and management oversight that beyond just the transactional, the management oversight of being the fiscal agent and the ability to set the course of the direction. So as Lynn will know, the department can only speak to the entity that is the fiscal agent. So if you're not the fiscal agent, you can't. There are lots of provisions that come along with that. So I'm not sure that it's just limited to that. The other thing that I think is important to put on the table here is, unlike a lot of the other things that we've been talking about Perkins loans and work study, the Gear Up program is a highly competitive discretionary grant in which most applications are not accepted. As a result, there are numerous instances. There's only one Gear Up grant in the entire state of Rhode Island now, called entire state, but there are other states that are larger than Rhode Island, in which, due to the competition, there is only one Gear Up grant in that state, whether it's a state grant or it's a partnership grant. There are states where there are no Gear Up resources, and I think that I would be concerned, again, about the chilling effect in the opposite direction of if there was only one Gear Up program. This isn't a question of whether or not everybody has access to it. If there was only one Gear Up program in a particular geographic area in which the fiscal agent was a pervasively sectarian institution of higher education, I have concerns about both the chilling effect on students who are eligible to receive these services. And so it's different than, hey, everybody's getting access to Perkins money or everyone's getting access to work study. There's not a universal component to this. There is a geographic and a limited component which requires us to look at this through a different lens.
I want to jump in for a second and just make sure people are clear about the structure of the Gear Up program, because I've heard it referred to as contractors, and I just want to make sure everybody understands that this is not a situation where the grantees are contractors of the Department of Education, and they're not acting as the Department of Education's agents. This, as Andrew mentioned, it's a very competitive grant program where people apply to get grant money, then they are responsible for administering the grant. The fiscal agent is actually designated not to be an agent of the Department of Education, but to be the entity that is responsible for making sure that the grant complies with all sorts of different requirements, both of the program, of the OMB circulars. So I just wanted to be clear that these are not people who are acting as our agent.
That's helpful, thank you. And I was probably, I'm sure I was one who used a term meaning something with non-technical. Again, it's this, though, on its face and as it's actually practiced and everything else, seems manifestly to be about making sure that the service that's provided as the fiscal agent is a secular service, and that the services in the program that are provided are secular services, which the government is required to do. And so the question about the institution, it's not about identity. It's about whether the institution is able to perform a secular service to do what the government is giving this grant to have done. And again, that's what we do all the time. And it's right that faith-based entities do lots of things under government grants, as government contractors and everything else. The question is always, are they able to deliver that service in a secular way? And what this terminology is about is, can you separate out? Can you do the thing that the government is giving you the grant to do, so that you're delivering that service as a secular service? And if you can, great, you're eligible. You can be considered. You may or may not get, because there's only one in the state of Rhode Island. You may or may not be the one who gets it on other neutral secular criteria. But if you can't do that, then what it's really saying is you're not able to deliver the service that the government is looking for. That's not about who you are. That's about being able to fulfill the needs of the program.
I think the issue for me is who gets to make that determination of who is pervasively sectarian. And if the government is the one doing that, that's a problem under the Establishment Clause. They can't pick and choose which religious entities are their favorite.
Yeah, there's similar thought. So I actually like your focus, although I still feel uncomfortable with the secular, not secular distinction, but that's a different subject, different debate. But it seems like to me that's where the focus should be. And if we struck this from here, these other things that would still regulate the activities seem to apply. So I'm thinking of something like the Dream Center in Los Angeles, which is clearly, I think, in any common sense way of talking about pervasively religious. They own a large educational network of online schools now that control the argosies, and the head of psychology, the president of that system, certainly has a very different perspective than the Dream Center. But they fund them. I've talked to him. He was nervous at first, but they operate unmolested by this organization, and so they don't have any intention of interfering with the way they approach GLBTQ issues or anything else. So it's a very different kind of emphasis, according to the people that were there. They were concerned about it at first because of the explicitly, I guess I'll use that language even though I don't like it, pervasively religious natures of the Dream Centers. But so far it has not been, that part of it hasn't been an issue at all. And so it seems to me what they do in managing the money is whether or not they would operate consistent with the guidelines of the relevant government interests, not how we would think about them in some religious taxonomy.
It would seem to me that the government is not measuring a colloquial understanding of pervasively sectarian. Are you a highly religious institution, but rather whether you can or cannot deliver secular services. And so I don't think that there's that sort of meddlesome trolling through that we've been talking about going on. It's about assessing whether you can do the actual job. And so if a highly religious organization can in fact deliver secular services under this specifically freighted terminology, that school would not qualify as pervasively sectarian, even though colloquially they might feel like they are and hope that they are.
Maybe we can advance this by perhaps a scenario. So I'm going to ask Stephen. I don't know whether you would describe Oklahoma Christian University as a pervasively sectarian institution. Some of the things that you have said indicate that that may be the case. So if you will permit me to assume that your university would fall under this category.
Yeah, and I would say we're pervasively Christian.
Okay. So if you're okay, I'll proceed with my example. So if this were to be struck and Oklahoma Christian were allowed to be the Gear Up lead entity, and there is the language with regard to 694.5 regarding the fact that benefits and services need to be secular, neutral, and non-ideological. When you go to your university president and say, "Great news, boss, we got a Gear Up grant. That sounds great. How much money is it? Okay. What do we need to do? Well, we need to provide these services, blah, 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 and these are the provisions." What sort of roadblocks does that create internally for your institution? How do you respond to the question from your president that says, well, it's my understanding that there are certain restrictions around discriminatory practices and hiring that accompany this money. How are we going to reconcile all of those things? Is this really? Are we setting ourselves up for more challenges than we want? That's sort of the open-ended question. I think it would be useful to sort of talk it out because we really don't have any examples of this actually happening in the past. I thought it would be useful for the conversation.
That would be the issue we would have to wrestle with is if the Department of Ed believes that the regulation as written is consistent with the law, and we were identified as pervasively Christian and not therefore able to do this, we wouldn't take that on. My position would be the secular, neutral, ideological language is still just as unconstitutional as the pervasively sectarian. So I don't think it fits to say what would we do in that situation. I do think, because we are, again, as I would say, pervasively Christian, and that means something to the way we operate, we would try and do that with integrity and keep the money separate like we're supposed to and use it only for college access situations for students from traditionally disadvantaged areas. So I would hope we would do it well.
Sure. No, I appreciate that. But what I want to make sure I understood is that from your perspective, it would be difficult to implement 694.5 as it is as the regulation currently states, that you sort of see it as you can't separate those two. Is that a correct characterization?
No, I'm just saying that language is equally offensive to the Constitution as pervasively sectarian is.
Okay. A question for the department. There is an oversight and monitoring responsibility of the department that's associated with this. What concerns would there, maybe not this isn't the right question, but No, you know what, I'll withdraw on that.
I liked Haven's thought that what we have here is a term of art where we don't all have the same mental definition of what's going on. I think that may enter into it. I was trying to think through what Andrew had described for the fiscal agent and what would be the kind of institution we would not wish to have that role. And I throw this out as a postulate to see if it's close. One is that we would not want, as a fiscal agent, a higher education institution that offered nothing but religious instruction and had no secular. And by religious instruction, I mean, for example, somebody training for the priesthood and had no secular. I'm postulating. And the second one, just to understand it, would be an institution that was so
Sure, sure. So I think it's important. I think it's important to remind everyone that the Gear Up services are provided to students from 6th to 12th grade, and that they are not provided. So when you talk about those examples, there are, with the exception of that first year, and those are transition to college services. There's a very clear delineation between Gear Up has no place on college campuses from a services perspective, so it's separate. So it's not necessarily what the institution may choose to do for its students. It's the role that institution may play in operating, and this is where it's sort of stuck in Title IV as opposed to Title I. We're sort of in this sort of this sort of oddity. That's where it sort of is. I guess my question would be, if the group said let's go with this recommendation of striking out the language that is not pervasively sectarian, from my perspective, the next step would be we need to add additional regulation to assure that institutions of higher education are taking the appropriate steps to make sure that discriminatory practices are not put in place relative to the letter and spirit of the Gear Up program. And so it's not, from my perspective, it's not enough just to take it out. If we're going to take it out, then we would have to talk about how what steps are going to be taken, what steps need to be codified through a regulatory process to ensure that Gear Up students are not injected with those types of practices. Again, that's different than students that are on your campus. These are students that are in, for the 97% of them are in public education settings, as again, a very small percentage of them are in private. So that would be, if we wanted to move in that direction, okay, the next thing would be, okay, let's get Ashley working on, okay, how are we making sure that those discriminatory practices are or employment choices that institutions have with regard to their own hiring are not, don't have a spillover effect with regard to Gear Up students that receive Gear Up services.
But are those other constraints around hiring, other sorts of things you're concerned about already in the regulations? Gear Up programs have to follow those already, or in the guidance documents, or?
I apologize. Without adding these to the regulations, even if it seems redundant, without adding those, I'm concerned about the monitoring burden that would be placed on the department in managing this particular grant.
I want to follow up. There are a number of different provisions that the Gear Up grantees need to follow, starting with the statute and regulations that relate specifically to that program, also the OMB circulars and other things, Edgar, that relate to all of our grant programs. One of the things in Gear Up is that it lists the specific allowable uses of funds, and they're not allowed to use money for things that are unallowable activities. I think that some of the things that people are concerned about would be unallowable activities. There's also in the OMB circulars quite a bit of specificity about how funds are used and accounted for, and there's things about hiring in there. So yes, I think many of the concerns are addressed elsewhere. Thank you.
So earlier we talked about 694.5, and I despite my reservations about that language, I saw that it could convey an unintended message if we just deleted it without qualification or explanation, and I agree with that. This doesn't seem like the same thing to me. To say that you're eligible, even, I don't even know of a faith program or entity that would naturally think of itself with the pervasively religious label, but let's just suppose someone did and said, oh good, we're in now, we can apply. To think just because of that it automatically means they're exempted from all these other requirements that are already there, procedural and regulation, or these guidance documents, I don't know how that perception would come about, nor would it make sense to me that they would be excused if they so interpreted it.
So prior to the role that I'm in now, I worked for a nonprofit organization also in Rhode Island. That nonprofit organization, which was a community-based nonprofit, was the largest recipient of Compassion Capital Fund and Strengthening Communities Fund program in the country, 4 separate discretionary grants. So I'm very familiar with the community and faith-based initiative that came out of the George W. Bush administration, and worked very closely both in my own state as well as nationally with faith-based organizations who were having their first experience with managing federal funds, and not large amounts. I mean, $15,000, $18,000, but federal funds is federal funds. And even though the White House initiative and those programs were run out of HHS, even though there was a lot of thought and effort about making sure about how those would operate, faith-based organizations got the money and then sort of tried to push the envelope, and I'd be concerned about that situation here of, okay, we'll take them. We're happy to do this. We want to do right by students. I think the intentions are good, and then it's the same sort of scenario that I said, whoa, what did we just sign on the dotted line to? Well, let's back up. Maybe we've got a little bit of flexibility here, or a little bit of tweaking there, and students should not be in the crossfire of that.
I can have some compassion for a religious school that might see this and go, "Ooh, we thought, we're reading down, and feel like we qualify," and then arriving at this and being like, I don't know how to feel about this language. Does this have a legal definition? Is this colloquial? Am I assessing this? Who's assessing this? And now all of a sudden I don't feel perhaps qualified or eligible. But I think this language is important, and I think it could, and I do think that this line B could go farther in clarifying what this language is meant to signify. And this language is meant to, I think, at this point, meant to signify such that you cannot carry out the duties as described elsewhere in this document. They all kind of work together, part and parcel. if we do start carrying out the recommendations from the Department of Education to strike all of that language, then we lose a reference point, which takes us back to really square one, whether we decide are government funds supposed to provide benefits and services that are secular. And now we're just at a much larger foundational question, which I thought had been decided.
One last thing. So, as I'm hearing this discussion, what I keep hearing in the back of my head, when you say things like that, or Richard says things like secular, it's only secular. I mean, so it's like the medieval doctrine of just war was tied around murder being wrong, but if you're killing someone in order to stop an unjust aggression and there's no other avoidable way, then the double intent makes it not murder. And so I know that's moral philosophy, it's not constitutional law, but I'm wondering, it seems to me like many people would see what they're doing as a sacred act. Now, what I appreciate from Andrew is I can imagine many faith-based institutions that would really be serious competitors for this particular program unless they're already doing some kind of program on their own accord. I've certainly seen faith-based institutions do things like Meals on Wheels programs where they don't stop to think, are you a member of our faith tradition, or will you stop and listen to a sermon? They just take food to shut-ins, and that seems to me like, I guess, if anything, there's a secular benefit. That's sort of getting a meal, if you can't get out, is. So I can imagine a scenario with all the complexity and variations of religion that exists, where someone just sees providing really the same exact services you do, and just writing a check, maybe to you, maybe they're the managers. Instead of the state of Rhode Island, whoever, they get the money and they write a check for you to do what you're doing. I can see faith institutions that would see that as completely on mission and the good they'd want to achieve, and that would be the end of it from their perspective, even though they would see themselves, I think, as doing that as a religious act.
So I think that's probably the right way to think about it, and nothing that you said implicates, as I understand it, a problem with respect to this, because again, your motivation for wanting to do these programs is a religious one. That's not a problem at all. That's just fine. That's true of lots and lots of faith-based entities that do lots and lots of provision of social services, including government-funded ones. I think that the way that the problem would come up is something more like this. You are an entity that call it a doctrinal matter, although I don't know if that's exactly the word that I mean, but that you will not work with anyone other than co-religionists, and that you will rather than promoting education with the kids choosing where they want to go and helping them to find placements, you will instead steer them toward your particular faith, because that's your religious mission, is to increase the size of your church. Those are all things that you can do, but you shouldn't be doing with government money. And if you can do if you can't carry out this government program without those kinds of things, that's where you're not in a position to be able to do what the government program is supposed to do. And that's not what you're talking about, right? You're talking about motivation, and I think that that's just not what this gets at all, and is the right way to think about the things to be respected and appreciated.
I would like to make sure we get to our last couple topics so that we've covered all the material and everybody can go home and think about them. So unless there's any last comment on this, I think I'd like to move on, if that's okay with the people. Okay, so the next two topics I think we need to look at together. This is the combination of 600 and 602. And I think the best way to look at this is to start with 602, which will then refer to a definition in 600. So where I am is in the red line. Yes.
I'm sorry, before we get into the particular section, I wonder if in the way that we had Andrew sort of talk through the lay of the land in Gear Up. So this is in this is what the world of accreditation, correct?
Yes.
Whether somebody can do that for us in the same way as to say, here's how to think about the whole gestalt of what's going on, so that then we can think about these sections in that context. I know that would help me.
Sure. I can give a very high-level overview of what accreditation is. I don't know if Bill would prefer to do that or interrupt me if I get something wrong. Or okay, so in order to participate in federal student aid programs, institutions have to be accredited by an accreditor who's recognized by the Secretary of Education. There are many, many accreditors out there. We do not recognize all of them. We only will entertain requests for recognition from accreditors who accredit institutions that have a federal link. So they either want to participate in the student aid programs run by the federal government, or they want to participate in programs from another federal agency that they're required to have recognition from the Secretary. So we at the Department of Education have a staff who receives these applications for recognition. We review them based on a number of criteria, mostly from the statute, some from regulation. The staff makes a recommendation to the Secretary. We also have an independent, it's NASICI, the National Advisory Committee for Institutional Quality and Integrity. Members of that committee are from the public. It's an advisory committee that makes a separate independent recommendation to the Secretary on the applications for recognition. And based on those two recommendations, the Secretary makes a determination as to whether we will recognize the accrediting agency. And so these provisions in 602 relate to only the accrediting agencies that we recognize. These regulations go through the process for obtaining recognition, the requirements for those agencies. So that's a high level, yeah.
I wonder if you would mind also doing something similar on state authorization?
Sure. State authorization, there is a requirement in the statute that institutions that participate in our programs be authorized by the state. We have had regs for a significant amount of time delineating how what we call brick and mortar institutions, so physical campus locations, get state authorization. It is much murkier at the distance level, and that's something that the full committee is taking up, is how to deal with exclusively distance, or even exclusively or non-exclusively distance programs is much harder. But the states, and I will probably get it wrong off the top of my head, but there's basically three things that the state has to look at that they have to be authorized by name, so the state can't just say all X type of institutions are authorized. They actually have to look at the individual institutions. They have to make sure that they are providing post-secondary as distinct from secondary. So there's some technical fields where there may be secondary education and post-secondary. They have to be looked at for their post-secondary. But it's and then the other thing is there needs to be a complaint process, and that looks different in different states. It can be the Attorney General's office, it can be a separate office. So that is the high level there. Yes. Mm-hmm.
As I understand it too, that requirement for state authorization applies if you're offering any college instruction in another state, including through distance mediums. So it's not just that you have a billboard and you're offering all your degrees, even if it's just one program, you need that authorization for the program to operate, correct?
I think that is an issue that's going to be discussed, and I don't think that's a simple, but
That's how a number of
yes,
states are interpreting it.
you're,
anyway.
yeah, okay, thank you. I'm sorry.
Your microphone, and you sleep all weekend. You wake up in a cold sweat.
Okay, so we are in part 602 accreditation, the red line. We are on page 14. At the bottom of the page, section 602.18. Everybody found this spot? Okay, so accrediting agencies are, these are the agencies that we recognize. They're required to enforce standards that respect the stated missions of the institution, including religious mission. And that's a requirement that has been in place. This is not something new that we're adding. But I wanted to flag it because it's relevant for what we are adding. There's some other language in here that doesn't relate to this committee that the people working on accreditation are going to look at. I'm going to kind of skip over that because I think that's not your expertise and others are looking at it. But on page 15 is where we get into things specifically relating to faith-based issues. And that is agencies. So in the middle of the page, there's an A. Agencies are required to provide the institution or program with a detailed written report that clarifies any deficiencies in the institution's or program's compliance with agency standards. And then we are proposing to add new language that would allow an institution to request the agency to perform a review of the accreditor's respect for an institution's religious mission and provide a written response to that review. And then C, it would prohibit denying pre-accreditation or accreditation or taking an action against an institution due to a compliance gap that's a result of the institution's adherence to its religious mission. And I think the last one is not related to this committee. And then I think at the same time we should talk about the new definition that we are proposing to add, which is in 600. So a separate document. There's a red line 600. It's another thick one. And then on page 7 of that document, we are proposing to add a new definition of religious mission that was not there. So the requirement for agencies to respect the religious mission has always been there. That's not new. But what we are proposing to do is add a definition for religious mission, and I will read the proposed definition.
What page is that on?
Okay, so this is in a separate document. This is 600,
Yep, I have it.
and on page 7 at the very top. You got it?
Yes.
Everybody on the right page? Okay. And I think Ashley has it on the screen as well. So religious mission. An institutional mission that includes or is founded upon religious tenets, beliefs, or teachings, and any policies or decisions relating to such tenets, beliefs, or teachings, including but not limited to any policies or decisions concerning housing, student life and activities, employment, curriculum, facilities, student governance, student admission, continuing enrollment, or graduation. So first, does everybody understand how these documents relate? And okay, then I would be very interested in your comments and response. Kimberly.
Well, I just wanted to make an overview comment that I think may get lost as we start discussing the religious aspects of this. But 602.18 is actually a really important statement of academic freedom that all institutions, religious or non-religious, of higher education have a real stake in this idea that the accreditor must respect the mission of the institution, whatever that mission is. And, that's, I think maybe if we were asked to say what's one of the most important aspects of academic freedom for any institution, it's that it be able to define its mission as it sees fit through its policies and the way it conducts itself. And so I just wanted to paint that bigger picture before we start getting into more of the weeds about. But this is a really important component of academic freedom and institutional autonomy, not just for religious institutions.
I just want to speak in support of adding a definition for religious mission. The term is used 3 times in the United States Code. It's used 23 times in the CFR, and it's never defined. So a definition that gives guidance to accrediting agencies of what the department determines is a religious mission, I think that's critical. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I wanted to, I'll probably have something as I think about it on that in a bit, but I wanted to start with 602.18 in the new sections, and I wanted to ask, the language that the department is proposing here, where does that language come from?
Are you, so you're talking about the 602.18 as opposed to the definition?
602.18, yes, on page 15, the B and C that that the department is proposing.
I drafted that. I'll confirm.
That to me, go.
I would say that that's also similar to the language found in the HEA in section 496K, the religious institution rule. Section 496, subsection K. It's similar to that. We can pull it up, I guess.
I might be mistaken about this, but that looks to me like language from the Prosper Act, which, as we talked about some yesterday.
It could be the definition, I believe, is not one that was considered.
And I wanted to pull that in as well, which gets to this puzzle about a controversial position, bill that Congress debated, did not pass, may or may not take up again, and that Congress thought was needed as a statutory matter. It seems a passing peculiar thing for the department to do by regulation what Congress chose not to do by statute. And I wonder first what the authority for that is, the regulatory authority for that, and then I want to raise the question whether that's necessarily a good idea, since these things do continue to be debated by Congress, whether it shouldn't be Congress in the first instance that's making that decision, as well as the real possibility that Congress needs to be needs to do that in the first instance. I don't know if you have, on behalf of the department, responses to that at this point, but I would love to know what the department's thinking is.
Well, I think I would say that we absolutely have the authority to regulate under the current statute as it exists. And there are many, many bills that are proposed relating to the Higher Education Act, some of which pass, some of which don't. We have an obligation to implement the program, and there is a very specific procedure laid out for how we regulate. We are following that procedure right now, and I don't think we can predict what Congress is going to do, and we need to implement the act in the best way that we see fit. And obviously, if there is a statutory change, that may have an effect on what the regulations are, and we would deal with that, but we're basically implementing the current law.
So I may have misunderstood, but what I heard you to be saying is that the department has regulatory authority under the Higher Education Act. That is certainly true. As a general statement, that's right, but that's not, I think, the same as saying authority in this particular respect. I know that when I was in the department, we spent a lot of time thinking about do we have under the statutes that each subagency and everybody else is enforcing, does the subagency have the jurisdiction to enforce, to make rules or anything else under the of a particular sort and under the particular requirements of the statute. And general regulatory authority was, in my experience, never thought to answer the question whether a particular regulation is authorized or not. And so that's part of what I'm struggling with.
Okay. Bill?
So just to make sure I'm understanding this correctly, in this same section, when the language of agencies or accreditors uses referring to the same entities. So agencies that are accredited by the U.S. Department of Education to accredit.
So we recognize agencies that accredit institutions.
Okay.
And accreditors can accredit institutions regardless of what we do.
Okay. Well, in some cases here they're referred to as accreditors, in other places as agencies. I just wanted to make sure that they were the same entities.
Yes, I'm sorry. In this section, agency does refer to accrediting agencies.
So this is the section where I have issues inserting this from the standpoint of someone who's worked with an accrediting body. But before I say that, let me just say, as someone who works at a faith-based institution, at one level it would be easy to have carte blanche and just say, well, a religious mission means we don't have to teach courses or something else. And I'm being facetious, of course. But when the language here says that, or if we have a compliance gap with standards of an accreditor, it can't be a problem for an adverse action. It can't be the basis for an adverse action if it's for reasons of our religious mission. That seems to me a little too general. So as I look at this, if we were to follow that all the way to the logical possibility of how it could be applied, let's suppose it worked that way, and faith-based institutions got to operate with deviations on every standard an accreditor might have to whatever degree they felt necessary from a religious point of view. That would create the unintended consequence.
Bill, I think your mic is off, which is unfortunate.
I think I'm good now. So let me be just to briefly restate. As a faith-based institution, I certainly appreciate the deference to our religious mission in accrediting. But as someone who's worked with accrediting bodies, I know the purpose of accreditation, in part, of course, is to ensure quality. And if this was understood as meaning that faith-based institutions could be wildly deviant from whatever standards or a wide range of standards, that would result in an implicit or explicit quality hit to institutions so accredited. It also creates other unintended consequences. So, for instance, I'll speak to the field I'm most closely connected to, psychology. So our graduates have to get licensed, and not every state requires that people who graduate from doctoral psychology programs have graduated from an American Psychological Association accredited program, but most do or give preference to credentialing that comes from having been a graduate of that kind of program. It seems to me that it would be ill-preparing those programs for their purpose if they couldn't ensure that the kinds of things that states are going to require the licensure in are met in the training program. And that doesn't give you a lot of wiggle room on some of the areas in which the standards are developed for accreditation. And so as I think through this, what I did last night is I just kind of proposed, if the goal is to provide some mechanisms that if a program feels that it's just being piled on because of its religious mission, on things that really can be accommodated without a loss of the really the intention and substantial goal of accreditation, then it seems like that might be able to be achieved in slightly different ways. So this is a very hasty proposal. I don't expect us to take it up now, but just for our future consideration, I would just ask you to take a look at what I was thinking here. But basically, it's recommending something other than what is being suggested here that I think an accreditor might be able to live with, that still provides a due process step for a faith-based institution that feels an accreditor may be acting disregard for their mission. What I have on the first page are the relevant sections that talk about some of this from the American Bar Association standard and rules. And you can see that APA plagiarized it years ago with the ABA's permission, and then added in a few other
everybody. For those of you watching on the live stream, we have had some technical difficulties and we apologize. We took a 10-minute break a couple minutes after it went down, so you probably haven't missed too much. In any event, we have recorded the whole thing and we will post it on our website. I think for the subcommittee, I think probably we should finish up the discussion on this and then call it a day, as we've lost one member and we're about to lose another. I think you have plenty to think about for the next few weeks until we're back together again and we can regroup. Does that sound like a plan? Everybody okay with that? Okay, good.
I assume that it is appropriate for us to continue conversations outside of, correct? Yeah, 'cause
Um,
I think
a-
because I think
absolutely.
this has been really interesting and that there can be fruitful things if we can talk with each other, so.
Absolutely, it is completely fine for you to talk with each other, to talk with me, to talk with Ashley. In addition to that, we would encourage you to talk to other people that you're representing to get feedback from outside this room. Everybody was sent a list with people's phone numbers and email addresses on it by email. I think in a few of your packets, the hard copy doesn't have contact information. If you did not get contact information on a hard copy and want it, we have them up here. For Department of Ed staff, all of our email addresses are firstname.lastname@ed.gov, which is probably the easiest way to get me and Ashley. You're more than welcome to reach out to us at any time. So, great, thank you.
While you're doing housekeeping,
Mm-hmm.
just where do we get this OMB circular that we keep talking about? Where would we find that?
I would be happy to send
The link.
a link to the OMB circulars. It is not fun reading, but it will certainly, I think Andrew can
It's
tell
by
you.
my nightstand.
Write it down for you.
It's basically very technical. A lot of it is about how to account for the federal funds. Okay, Haven.
I do have a question. So we left off discussing the issue of religious mission and compliance. In the case of, as example, Gordon College and the sort of inquiry into its accreditation vis-a-vis its treatment of LGBTQI students and staff. And that was falling in line with something I was already trying to sort out for myself, which is anywhere in this document about accreditation, any specifics about, does this impart any particulars with respect to student treatment or hiring or culture issues or non-discrimination, those kinds of things? Like, because this feels very much about process and administration. You have to have standards and they have to be applied consistently, but we don't tell you what those standards have to be. And I was speaking for my constituency of queer and trans young adults on faith-based campuses. Religious mission has been at times a financially and spiritually devastating experience for them. And so I'm curious, where does that come up, if not in Part 602?
Anne-Marie, I'm wondering if you could see if Herman or somebody on his staff, I actually think Nicole's watching this. It might be better for them to respond than for me to get it wrong. Thank you. So hopefully we can have somebody from the accreditation staff address that more precision. So hold it, we'll come back to it. Thank you. Other? Bill?
So just to openly talk about these issues, so in the proposed language I have, I use the compelling public interest phrase. I don't intend that to mean that the Ed Department gets to decide based on its idea of how the winds are blowing, what aspects of the religious mission it can respect at any one given time or not. And so for those of you who are legal, you might be able to suggest a better phrasing that would convey that idea. Even if you want to oppose what I'm suggesting there, that's fine. But if there's another concept that better conveys what I'm trying to suggest, but that's for discussion later on.
Would you be, I just wanted to ask
Okay.
whether you would be willing to email, so what Bill gave us on paper, whether the department would be willing to send that around by email as well?
Absolutely,
I know
yes.
that'll be helpful for me.
Yeah.
As in, I might lose it otherwise, and I don't want to do that.
So Herman, I apologize to put you on the spot like this. This is Herman Bounds, who's director of the accreditation division in the Office of Post-Secondary Education. Oh, and Nicole works on Herman's staff. So I was starting to get questions about whether agencies are required to look at hiring practices and other things. And Haven, if you wouldn't mind repeating your specific question, it was a little out of my league. I want to make sure we get the right
Yeah.
answer.
Let me see if I can make this concise. So, it is in fact inspired by what Bill passed around, some examples of a kind of accrediting considerations from the American Psychological Association, American Bar Association. And they delve into issues of, fair treatment, non-discrimination, what you might broadly term kind of like culture and diversity issues. And I'm curious if in setting the standards for which organizations ought to be accredited or how those accrediting agencies ought to carry out their duties with respect to accrediting schools, is there any norm setting around the sort of culture and diversity issues or non-discrimination, fair treatment? Is there a reference document somewhere?
Unfortunately, there's nothing really in the criteria for recognition that we look at when we're reviewing accrediting agencies that touches those specific issues. I think the main topics are the respect for whatever the institution's religious mission and those types of criteria. But there's really nothing that speaks to those types of things.
I just want to make sure I understood. So that's in general, not just about religious missions, but about mission in general?
So if I understand your question correctly,
I'm not sure I understood your question, so if you don't, it wouldn't be a surprise.
So basically, regarding those things such as like hiring practices and all those things, there are no criteria related to that for any for any institution or organization.
And are there standards on other things that we can, like a manual that's here are the things that from the department apply, and then the agencies do their own things, or is there no such thing?
Yeah, really, we tell the agency that you have to have specific standards, and we leave that hollow, and the agency then has the requirement to fill that in. For instance, standards for faculty, standards for curriculum. We say you have to have those standards, and then it's up to the agency to spell out what those are.
Standards on enrollment?
We say they have to have enrollment policies, right? But we don't kind of dictate what that is, and I think that's down under in 60216, which is where the agency has to comply with all our standards criteria. Talks about, I think, enrollment and academic calendars and those type things. Yeah, recruitment.
I would also add that the bright line metrics for accreditors is also in the HEA, which is what the Department of Education actually goes off of. Right. So those bright line metrics are in the HEA section 496.
So although you allow accreditors to develop their own detailed standards, there are requirements, though, within the parameters, for instance, consistency with the mission of the entities they're accrediting, that sort of thing, where they are expected to comply with, ensure that the standards are complied with, correct? I mean, so if they set standards, then their job is to make sure entities they're accrediting comply with them.
Yes, that's absolutely true.
Herman, before you came in, I did a high-level overview of accreditation, and I wanted to make sure, while we have the accreditation experts here, if you have other questions in general about how accreditation works or our recognition, they're the people to ask. We can bring them back, but we may as well ask any questions we have now. Stephen.
So I guess my question would be, currently under the department's oversight of accrediting agencies, if the agency does not respect the religious mission of the institution, what is the religious institution's remedy, I guess is the best way to say it. What do you all do as the department?
We would hope, since accreditation is voluntary, we would hope that during that first exchange, as that institution is going through the accreditation process, there would be some discussion about, the accreditor standards versus, the institution's mission, and hopefully some of that stuff will get ironed out before the accreditation process, is completed. However, in all cases, under 60223, institutions have the ability to file complaints. And of course, then, accreditors must have a complaint policies to review complaints filed against them. In the event that an institution goes through the accreditor's complaint processes, and then say they're not happy or don't think that the accreditor treated them fairly, then they can file those complaints with our section, and then we review to ensure that the accreditor followed its own policies and procedures. They're clear and the institution understands. Right.
So just following up on Stephen's question, I don't want to know.
We're just going to say that the criterion for the academic calendars, recruiting and all, that's 60216 A1 Romanet 7, if anybody wanted to see that.
Okay. So just to follow up on Stephen's question, how often have there been complaints made to the department after an institution generally, not just a religious institution, has gone through the accreditor's complaint process? How often does that happen, that a complaint's made to the department?
Yeah, we Nicole, I would say we probably process could be 4 or 5 per year.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and it depends. The reasons for the complaints depend. Sometimes there are student issues. There are, usually it's when a student feels that that something has happened, and then they file their complaint with the institution, the accreditor, and then the student's not happy with the results. And as I say, then we get the complaint and look into the issues.
So the student files the complaint.
Yeah, a lot of them do begin with the student. Now, we don't get involved until the student exhausts the institution's complaint processes. Then once that happens, if the student is unhappy with what the institution, we direct him to the accreditor. And once it goes through that process, many times the student is still unhappy, and then we will sometimes end up getting those complaints also. But our review is of the accreditor, and if the accreditor has applied its policies and procedures at the institution, and that's what we kind of convey to the student.
And have any of these complaints, like 4 or 5 a year, have they involved the religious mission
Nicole, I don't
so
think
far?
we've had any. Not that I can recall. We can check, but not that I recall.
And so how long does the process take? Can you ballpark it or
Yeah, it's
parameters?
it's tough. We've had them go on for what? Go ahead.
Some complaints can be researched for, depending on the evidence we receive and the review. It can go on for either a month or it can go on for up to a year, depending on the correspondence back and forth between the complainant as well as the agency and making sure the investigation is thorough.
So at the department level. So that's on
Correct.
top of what's happened at the accreditor.
Right. We're again, at that time, we're getting the documentation from from the student and the accrediting agency to make sure they've exhausted their use of the accreditor's policies, and we make sure that each policy was followed based upon the criteria for the department.
And I'm surprised the student's the main, or is a frequent complainer?
Well,
Complainant,
Yeah.
what
It-
does that look like?
Well, it's not a frequent. I just wanted to let
Yeah,
everyone
yeah,
know
yeah, yeah.
it does happen.
Yeah.
It does happen at times where
Okay.
the originator of the complaint is a student who's not
Okay.
happy with the institution's complaint processes, and then they're not also not happy with how they feel the accreditor handled the situation. And those take a little longer because then we want to make sure we get all the information. Sometimes we have to ask for additional information, documentation, and it takes a while to get through it. We have had complaints. Total amount of documentation was probably up to 2,000 pages of stuff that we have to feed through. Now, most of it you can get through pretty quickly because you can tell what's important or not, but to do due diligence, we have to look at everything.
I'm sorry, because I know other people have their tents up or placards, but can I just ask, so there's no hearing within the process in the department, I assume? It's all paper?
It really is paper. So what happens is, normally when we look at a complaint and we make our complaint determination, it will be, say, we don't find the agency non-compliant with, with accreditation, with their accreditation standards or the criteria, with the application of their standards or criteria. A complaint in which, say, we find an accreditor non-compliant and say the accreditor does not agree with our finding, then that complaint has to go through part of the recognition process, meaning staff, we can't make a final determination in that case. We can't make the accreditor do those things. So what happens is we forward that, and that's reviewed. We make a recommendation. We bring the accreditor in, and they must appear at the National Advisory Committee for Institutional Quality Integrity. They will look at the complaint. Both our recommendations, will go up to the senior department official, and then that then will become the final complaint determination. And then it may then have other legal implications too. So normally they get handled at our level because we may find something wrong. Usually accreditors will say, "Yep, you're correct. We didn't follow our policy. We'll change it." But in cases where the accreditor doesn't believe that they're non-compliant, we can't be the final. My staff can't be the final determination on those complaints.
And then when the decision's made by the secretary, and is that then appealable to a federal district court, or what is that?
Yes, that's
Okay.
An agency can always has that opportunity, I would believe, but I would.
I want to jump in because I abbreviated our process a little bit.
No, I just.
The initial determination by the secretary is not really by the secretary, it's by the senior designated official. And that decision is then appealable to the secretary. And then the secretary's decision is appealable. So there's an internal step, which I left out.
No, I'm not trying to be real picky or anything, but I just don't understand the process, and it matters. But also, it's obvious that it can be a very lengthy process.
We try not to make it lengthy,
Right,
but
right.
To give due diligence to everyone's concern, we do our best to look at all the information we have.
Thank you.
I'm not sure, but mine will be quick and easy. Thank you for stepping us through and explaining that. I found that really helpful, and I will also, you said you'll forward along the information on what complaints there have been and whether there have been about religious mission and all that. And I know I will find that immensely useful also in figuring out what this proposed change is addressed to. So thank you for that.
I just have one question. So you want a total number of complaints, and then also if there were any that were related to religious mission. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that was
Is
what
that correct?
Kim had in mind, and,
Okay.
and I think that would be great. And
Okay.
to the extent that there can be, if there are any on religious mission, some
Okay.
details on that would be useful also.
Okay.
And I see Stephen is nodding as well. Thank you.
I may be speaking into the theoretical space on this, but I am curious if there's been an instance of when an accreditor judged an educational institution to be non-compliant, and that compliance gap was justified by the institution based on religious mission, is there any point that the religious mission justification sort of breaks down or becomes simply an irreconcilable difference between accreditor and educational institution? I'm just wondering, like, what are the limits to the explanation of religious mission, if there are any? And maybe those have to be found through lived experience.
Yeah, that is a. So I would say right now, no, we have not had any of those situations occur. And I think in those situations, we would probably, because our reviews are really based on the language and the criteria for recognition and the criteria that we have to review. When we get into those areas that are like that, you know, we rely heavily on our Office of General Counsel to help us weed through those things. And I think that's how we would have to handle a situation like that. Not trying to not give you an answer, but I think that's just how we would have to. Because they're not black and white or cut and dry. We would just have to do that.
I was about to say I had forgotten to put my table tent down, and then I realized I do have another question. Do accreditors have any role in ensuring compliance with the civil rights laws within, say, OCR's jurisdiction? I ask about that because I was there for a while, and so those are statutes that I'm familiar with. Does the accrediting process involve looking into that at all?
Yeah, our criteria doesn't speak to that, so I really couldn't answer that. Couldn't answer that question.
Just to follow up on that previous line of conversation, if a Department of Education accredited agency, accreditor, determined that some things really had to be strict compliance expectations because of the nature of, say, this is a professional accreditor or something else, and to be licensed, people have to meet this criteria, whatever it is. And they dug in their heels around it, but an accredited entity claimed that there would be a compliance gap because of their religious mission. What would be a justifiable rationale for the accreditor to dig in their heels around complete compliance on their standard versus deference to the religious mission for the Department of Education?
I think just as you say, if there was an issue where, say, a student was not going to, I guess, obtain the skills that they need to be awarded that credential, I think that would be the point where the accreditor might dig in his heels and say, this is going to be required for licensure, and then, I just think that would probably be a reason that they would do it. Again, hopefully those things will be worked out, well before we get to that point. As I say, accreditation being voluntary, I'm hoping that religious institution would look at the accreditor standards, especially if it's a programmatic accreditor who prepares students for licensure, would look at those requirements and make a determination at that point. I hope I answered your question.
Harmon and Nicole, thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate it. You're welcome to stay if you would like. We're watching. So I didn't need to send Anne Marie. I could have just whistled. Thank you. Okay, great. So going back to section 602.18 and the corresponding definition of religious mission.
You had said before, Lynn, that you were thinking, given the absences, that we should stop. I don't know if you're still thinking that or if you've kind of revised what you're thinking on that.
So it's 3:43. Do you want to call it a day?
I'm okay with returning to this later, but do
Does
what
anyone
wants to
have
do.
travel plans coming up,
My
or?
planes are being delayed again, so I'm probably driving.
Oh, no.
I just got a notice.
Oh, dear. It's up to the committee what you'd like to do. I can stay. I'm happy to let you go.
This is a big discussion that I think will take longer than the time we have.
Okay, then
We have
it
2 more
sounds
rounds of
like,
meetings.
Well, let me. Should I do this?
yeah.
Is there anything that we need to discuss right now, if we were to go ahead and break earlier, versus being able to pick back up when we meet? Have we discussed all the main things to initially, so we can know each other's thoughts and then be able to be prepared for whatever comes next?
Yes, I think we have presented all of the language. We didn't talk about each provision in each program, but all of the discrete pieces of language we did discuss.
Well, with that being said, I am not opposed to the idea of breaking, and then with our various assignments and being able to pick back up with solutions and ideas and further thoughts.
I concur with Emmanuel.
Okay. I think that's the sense of the group. It has been an absolute pleasure. I really appreciate all of the effort that went into this. I know traveling was tough this week, and you all offered a lot of really good thought and ideas, and thank you, and I look forward to seeing you in a few weeks.
Do you want to remind them?
Oh, leave your badges and your name tents here. We'll use them again next time.